Today we're going to talk about two Iron Age empires during the classical period, Han China and Rome. And the College Board's objective for you throughout this unit is mostly going to be about comparison. They'll want you to be able to compare these two empires and other Iron Age empires well enough that you could actually write an essay on the topic. So we've set up this PowerPoint as a kind of comparative exercise to help you move toward that goal. It has showed up on the College Board's AP World History test more than one time in the past, so it's a strong likelihood that this kind of comparison will show up again. The first thing that we need to talk about is really the geographic and time scope of both of these empires. They both last, at their height anyway, approximately 400 years. Rome will continue a little while longer, but after about the mid-200s CE, Rome will begin to fall apart. And by 476 will have pretty much disappeared, except for in the eastern portion of the empire, which will continue much, much longer than that. The Han Dynasty has a lot more kind of set parameters for its dates, from about 200 BCE to about 200 CE, if that can kind of set you in a time in history. And both of them have a population of about 50 million people, and both of them cover several million square miles. So they're of about equivalent size, of about equivalent population, and about they lasted about the same amount of time. Let's go ahead and look at the structure of each of the empires, because that's an important component. Here you see the Han Empire, and up in the north, if you'll recall, the Bronze Age civilization of the Shang and Zhou dynasties were set up along the Yellow River up in the north. By this dynasty, the Han Dynasty, China had expanded its reach way to the south, and they actually controlled the Yangtze River Valley and the rice growing areas, which was a really great help for their agricultural productivity. And they also have this funny finger that kind of reaches out into Central Asia. This is the Han Dynasty actually working to control trade routes. One of the main objectives and benefits of a stable unified empire is that empire's ability to protect and promote trade routes, and the Han Dynasty is actually protecting the Silk Roads, which through intermediaries connected all the way over here to the Mediterranean. Over here, of course, is Rome, and most people usually think about Rome as being a European empire, and that's a bit of a misnomer. Although Rome was founded in Rome, modern-day Italy, their empire stretched really around the border of the Mediterranean, and I want you all to write out to the side of the word Rome in this heading that Rome is really a Mediterranean empire. This is a huge advantage for Rome. As you can see on the map, they have this massive inland sea that they're able to trade around and transport grain, for example, very easily from Egypt, which they owned, all the way back to Rome, a city of about 1 million people, which was really fed out of the wheat produced here on the Nile River. So they have this awesome advantage. Over here, you can see that China has none of that awesome inland sea advantage. So that was a bit of a hamper to their economic abilities. All right. Both of these empires had kind of dissimilar origins. On the left, let's talk about Han China first. Han China really was building on empires that had already existed before it. Rome, on the right-hand side, really generates out of something new. There were no really large empires in Italy and around it before Rome was built. There was a rival, but it was a rival city-state and trading empire in Carthage, which is on the North African coast. But Rome really kind of built on its own foundations, whereas the Han Chinese built on the sort of precedent set by first the Shang Dynasty, then the Zhou Dynasty, and finally the Qin dynasty, which was the first dynasty to really fully unify China. And that dynasty unified China right after the warring states period that we've already talked about. And quickly that dynasty collapsed, and the Han Dynasty sort of built on top of its foundations. So there were a lot of cultural characteristics and government characteristics that will continue into the Han period that were already present during the Shangzhou and Qin dynasties. Okay, just like all empires, the Roman and the Han empires both focus on expanding their territory. They, for much of their history, were threatened by pastoralists that lived outside of their borders, or in the case of Rome, by nearby civilizations. As you can see on the map, Rome is quite near to a lot of old centers of civilization. Over here is Mesopotamia, which had been part of the Persian Empire and then Alexander the Great's empire. And over here in China, you can kind of see beyond the Chinese Great Wall, there's a large grassland that exists up here, and there are pastoralists that just sort of used the steppe as their way of life. And pretty consistently, Rome and Han China came under threat from either neighboring civilizations in the case of Rome or pastoralists in the case of China. And this was used a lot as an excuse to expand the borders. The thought was, let's expand our borders and conquer our neighbor. That will make us more secure. But of course what happens is the length of the borders is simply increased, so there are even more perceived threats than there were before. Another conquest takes place, and there's this pattern which will eventually lead, pretty much in both cases, to overexpansion and the inability to really hold their empires together. Both of them had a very, very similar economic base, and we're going to see this continue right up through about 1800. So for several thousand years, the economic base of any empire is going to be agriculture. Land in this system is really equated with wealth. To have wealth is to own land, and to own land is to be wealthy. The government taxes really came from collecting a portion of the annual harvest, and large landowners had to pay these taxes, but usually they were collected kind of in a series of steps. For example, if you're a peasant working on a Han elite's land, then you would pay your landlord your rent, and then your landlord would pay up to the national level. So there was sort of a gradation of taxation that was going on there. Now, as an important point, and I've seen this as a multiple choice question on the AP test before, on the released exams, China really relies on free peasant labor, while Rome relies on slavery. Up to 1/3 of Rome's population were slaves at any given moment. And at this time, slavery is almost synonymous with being a prisoner of war or being a conquered person taken in battle. The ancient idea of slavery based on being a prisoner of war is going to continue for a really long time, up until pretty much the advent of sugar production on a more industrial scale, which will happen much later in history. Now, China didn't have to rely on slaves as much. They had a lot of peasants that they relied on instead, and we'll hopefully talk a little bit about why Rome came to not depend on peasants a little bit later in the lecture. Both empires had to work a lot to integrate themselves, meaning to bring themselves all together. Over on the right, you'll see an example of a Roman road that's still around today. You can see it still looks pretty good. A lot of what these empires did to link themselves together was build roads. We usually refer to this as infrastructure. So if you'd like to put a little star beside that word infrastructure, that would probably be a good idea. Roads are great. They allow you to move troops quickly. They allow trade to be conducted more easily across wider areas. And Rome, especially, I think, is excellent in terms of their construction techniques. They will invent concrete, and they'll also create these huge works of infrastructure called aqueducts, which are kind of arched pathways that carry water from usually mountains into cities. And there are some aqueducts that are still actually around and functional today. So it's just a way to make sure that the cities and the farmland are able to get water into them easily. And an empire, because it's unified, large, and has big tax base, is really able to pull off these kinds of massive infrastructure projects for the first time in world history. We saw monumental architecture in the Bronze Age civilizations, but nothing really like these roads, like the Persian Royal Road and these Roman roads that connected, thousands of miles of land that were connected over, under one central government. So, okay, China is going to really focus on their bureaucracy and their ideology. And their bureaucracy and their ideology are going to be very closely intertwined. Confucianism, which we've already covered, was the official state ideology of China, and it identified a lot of principles that were necessary to establish order and harmony in society. If you'll recall, we talked about the superiors in society exuding ren, or justice and benevolence, down to the lower orders in society, and the lower orders of society sort of giving back the concept of Zhao, which meant respect and obedience. Within this hierarchy, the emperor, of course, was up at the top, and he was not a god, but he had a lot of special links to heaven or the gods, and was associated with morality through the rituals that he was supposed to correctly and specifically conduct. And those rituals had to do with the veneration of his ancestors. And when an emperor was able to follow this moral code and properly venerate the ancestors and give justice to the people of his empire, then heaven would look on his rule with favor, and he would maintain the mandate of heaven, which is a concept that we first talked about when we covered the Zhou dynasty. And it really kind of justifies the dynastic cycle. The idea that one family holds the mandate of heaven helps them stay in power, and when things start to go wrong in China, it's viewed as a sign that that mandate had been lost. The other really important thing about this ideology of Confucianism is that it helps China develop a very sophisticated bureaucracy with a lot of government officials that were staffed by an educated middle class. And I'd like you to write out to the side of this is a big deal, put a star beside it. I'd like you to write out to the side that this educated middle class is considered to be part of the gentleman class, or the superior man, as Confucius usually terms it. And this superior man always means someone who's educated and behaves in moral and proper ways. And the way that you get into this very elite bureaucracy as a part of that educated middle class, or the superior man or gentleman, is to be a part of the Confucian exam system. And this is a huge point for China, because this Confucian exam system is actually going to stay with us through about 2,000 years of Chinese history, until the early 1900s. So there was a Imperial Academy located in the capital of the Han Dynasty, and students of any class, as long as they could pay, could attend that Imperial Academy in preparation to take a Confucian exam, which was a really, really high pressure exam that students had to score well enough on to become a member of that bureaucracy. So these were really high stakes tests, and they were given annually. It took several days, and students were, if they were able to score highly enough on them, could be admitted into this really respected and high status class of bureaucrat gentlemen who, again, were educated elites. Technically speaking, anybody could be a part of this educated elite, although you can imagine that being able to leave your family and study and take these tests and not be at home helping your family farm and pay their taxes made it difficult for people in the lower classes to actually participate in the exam system. But technically speaking, it was open to anybody, and that gave China some semblance of social mobility for people in the lower classes who would be able to, through getting an education, rise up and be a member of this elite bureaucracy that helped very carefully run this huge Chinese empire. Rome had a much less complex bureaucracy than the Han did. There was no really centralized control over their bureaucracy. Instead, when Rome conquered an area, it usually looked to assimilate the elites who are already there and create out of those elites a new middle class bureaucracy. So whatever your local law had been was usually kind of overlaid with the common legal code of Rome, but the people who were actually administering that law were still your local elites that had been in power before they were conquered by Rome. So it's a much more relaxed and less centralized way to run a bureaucracy, which is a really significant point between these two. Rome perhaps had better infrastructure, but the bureaucracy was less centralized than it was in China. Instead, Rome focused a lot on kind of building up the idea of Roman civilization, glory, stability, and bringing sort of proper civilization to the people that they conquered. And this really becomes Rome's ideology, in the same way that Confucianism and the way the society was structured and the government was structured in China became the Han Dynasty's ideology. The idea that Rome was a glorious civilization that would conquer and bring peace and proper civilization to everyone that it conquered was really Rome's ideology. And as a part of this, they actually developed a cult of worship of deceased emperors, where people would declare dead emperors gods, and then, like burn candles or say prayers to those emperors. So Rome's ideology was a little bit less centralized, I would argue, as well. And then Han Dynasty China, of course, had that very centralized and specific ideology of the Confucian social system and political order. All right, both of these empires are very much focused on conquest, and both of them send settlers out into colonies. China does this in a much more centralized way. However, China made it a priority to attempt to spread ethnically Han Chinese. Han Chinese are the majority ethnic group still today in China, and the Han government intentionally sent groups of Han ethnic peoples out into areas that they conquered. They helped to spread the use of Mandarin language, which was a required language. All of the government's business done by those gentlemen bureaucrats was conducted in the standard language, and this really helped to pull the whole empire together, both ethnically and linguistically or culturally. So again, China's ability to centralize itself around their bureaucracy and around their ideology of Confucianism really left it as a pretty coherent whole. Again, anybody could participate in that exam system, and the ideology was spread through the elites and through the language throughout Chinese territory. Rome was, again, a little bit looser in terms of this. The colonies that Rome founded were really military outposts, and the elites of whichever areas were conquered by Rome were definitely assimilated into Roman culture, but it wasn't quite as centralized or as intentional a process as it was in China. Rome spread things like cultural elements like bathhouses or the worship of Roman gods throughout its territories, and it encouraged elites that they had conquered to become a part of Roman civilization or culture, which was a part of their ideology. But they're a little bit looser about this whole process. For example, in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, so for example, North Africa and Egypt, the area around the eastern portion of the Mediterranean Sea, modern Turkey. In those areas, Latin, the language of Imperial Rome, never really took over as the primary language. In the East, people still spoke and wrote in Greek and still looked up to Greek culture, which Rome did as well. Rome was definitely a Hellenized society. One really great method that Rome used to pull all of its people together was to offer Roman citizenship, which came with a lot of rights and elite status. They extended citizenship to any person who served for, I think it was 20 years in the army. And at the end of your term of 20 years service, you were given Roman citizenship. We talked about the concept of citizenship in the last lecture. It's a concept that means that you're really a part of the political community with both rights and responsibilities. And in Rome, this really conveyed you with very special status. There were special laws and special courts and special rights that you had that people who were not specifically citizens of Rome were not allowed to have or participate in. So again, China, more centralized, more local cultures, more autonomy, and Rome, of course, had a lot looser control. Okay. In terms of the government of both, I think we can make a lot of similar statements about the two in terms of using a bureaucracy, even though China's was more centralized, and using set forms of taxation at consistent places, times, and in consistent amounts that allowed them to function really well. They increased their coercion with their very strong militaries that, of course, were able to transport themselves quickly over their infrastructural systems and the roads. And both empires really tried to put their hand directly into the economics of the period. So in order to foster trade, for example, and in Han China to control the trade of salt and iron, which were two hugely important products for the time. Our word salary actually comes from salt because it was such a valuable commodity that people could actually be paid in it. And iron, of course, is the source of power in these areas. Your army is able to be so coercive because of the use of iron rather than bronze or any other metal, because that was the best metal on hand at the time. Over on the right, you can actually see an aqueduct. So if you were wondering what an aqueduct looked like, there one is right there on the right. Okay. Let's talk about Han's territorial expansion. We talked about this a little bit already, but for the Han Chinese, they expanded on the previous dynasties, but because they were more isolated and surrounded more by pastoralists rather than other civilizations, they reached a point that had greater sustainability than Rome's did. In addition, their labor force was reliant on peasants rather than slaves, which meant that China didn't need to constantly expand in order to find a new source of labor. It had peasants at the ready. In Rome, there were all kinds of civilization centers around it, and so perhaps it felt more threatened and a greater need to expand. They also usually paid their soldiers in plots of land. So if you're going to pay your soldiers in plots of land, you also have an incentive to continuously expand. And slaves. I think this is probably the big one. As Rome's history kind of unfolds, what happens is most of the wealth or land gets concentrated up at the very top of the social hierarchy, and there were a lot of landless peasants who were no longer able to make a living by farming because their land had been consolidated into the hands of the elites. So those people wound up flooding into cities like Rome, which grew to a size of about 1 million people. Therefore, you had nobody really to work the land out in these rural areas, and so Romans were really driven to conquer land in order to get POWs as slaves to work this agricultural land. And really that was just a function of the difficulty that they had in making sure that land ownership stayed in the hands of a lot of people rather than a few. For Rome, what ended up happening is that only a small percentage of the population owned land, and that small percentage owned an awful lot. So people who might have worked that land didn't own the land anymore, so they went to the cities, and Rome needed a different source of labor. So there we've got the Roman soldiers receiving land. All right. This is a very strong similarity. Both Rome and Han Dynasty China are dominated by patriarchy and have a very specific reverence for fathers. In a Roman household, usually if you were of a decent status family, when you'd walk into the front entrance of a home, there would be bust statues of past heads of the family, aka the male head of the family. So you'd see, like, a bust of your great-great-grandfather, your great-grandfather, your grandfather, and your dad sitting in your front foyer. In China, of course, there's a huge focus on ancestor veneration, which was incorporated into that ideology of Confucianism, all the way up to the very top, with the emperor venerating his own ancestors. However, there was a difference. For the Han Dynasty, the family, the idea of the father at the head of the family giving benevolence down to the inferior members of his family becomes the model of organization for the government, for the imperial government. So, for example, the emperor is viewed similarly to a father, and again, in that Confucian ideology, he's giving off benevolence and justice to his people, and protecting the weak, all sorts of things that a dad is supposed to do. That concept of the emperor as a father, conducting proper Confucian rituals and having proper Confucian behavior really sets the tone for what the government is supposed to look like in China, in a way that it doesn't in Rome. Nobody in Rome really views the emperor as a father figure. He's just viewed as a military leader. All right. Both Rome and Han Dynasty China have very specific religious systems, but both are challenged in the later part of their existence by different religious ideas that begin to filter into their empires. So both Rome and Han Dynasty China kind of have ritualistic religions at the beginning of their history. These are the kind of religions that we talked about in the Bronze Age, where you make sacrifices and have kind of an impersonal relationship with the gods. As time moves on, we're going to actually encounter something called the Axial Age. If you look on your learning targets, you can find it in Learning Target 1. And the Axial Age is really about changing religion from being focused on this impersonal view of the gods to a really personal view of the gods. And in Rome, we see the advent of Christianity actually arising within the Roman Empire itself and eventually coming to dominate and become the official religion of the Roman Empire very shortly before its fall. And in China, we see Buddhism, which originates in India, slowly move into China via trade routes. And it really doesn't have much of a position during the Han Dynasty, but as soon as the Han Dynasty falls in the early 200s BCE, people are looking for answers and stability and meaning within their lives as this new chaotic period takes hold after the Han Dynasty falls. And Buddhism really fits right into that need and actually starts to grow at an almost exponential rate during the 300s, 400s, and 500s in China itself. All right, both of these empires decline primarily through overexpansion. Now, China didn't expand quite as much as Rome did, but China had more pastoralists to worry about than did Rome, although both of them were eventually taken out by really pastoralist nomads. The borders became simply too long to defend. They couldn't put enough military garrisons along the borders. They couldn't build enough walls. Financing the payments of those troops and the building of those walls and maintaining of those walls became so expensive that it really shot the tax base of both of these empires. And once they were unable to defend their very huge borders, they were experiencing nomadic invasions. And those invasions really sapped the confidence of their people. Citizens of both of these empires began to feel like perhaps the empire's ideology was not correct. And they thought perhaps in China, maybe the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. And it really became more exacerbated by the fact that in both empires, a lot of the wealth was concentrated up at the very top of the social hierarchy. So instead of having a lot of people with some money who would pay their taxes, you had very few people with almost all of the money. And what they did is attempt to, and successfully, use their elite position within society to decrease their tax payments. So just at the time when they need more taxes to finance the protection of these huge borders, they actually are decreasing their tax base. An interesting point that you'll need to know about the fall of these empires is that in Western Rome, most of the cultural elements die out with the empire. For example, I'm not speaking Latin. I don't use Roman numerals in my math. China is a much different story. The Han Dynasty is destroyed, but its institutions, its culture, and its traditions are going to be revived by later dynasties. It's a wonderful example of cultural and political continuity. For example, if someone were to read a document from the Han Dynasty in modern China, they would be able to fully comprehend and understand the language that was on the paper, because that language is still the same today. Whereas, of course, Rome's cultural legacy has not been as strong, perhaps because of their lack of centralization in terms of the bureaucracy and the ideology. So here's the little sort of reasoning. Rome doesn't have a centralized version of their ideology as China does. Although the idea of Rome as a political entity was very strong, the idea that Rome was glorious, that Rome brought civilization, peace to its people was there. Once Rome was unable to do those things, the ideology died out. In China, the ideology was Confucianism, a social and political order. And as the Han Dynasty died away, that idea of how one should properly behave and how social and political behavior should be regulated stays around, even though the central government is no longer there. So that's it for today. Again, bring questions with you to the classroom, and we'll be dealing with these two empires all week. So hopefully we'll go into a lot more depth with you guys as our class continues.